start with a quick intro about Shashank, if you could introduce yourself, and then we'll dive in from there.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me here. Right, great to join, and lovely to see an audience that made it out through braving the traffic. Just in terms of a brief introduction, so I am one of the co-founders of Axio. Formerly, we were known as Capital Float, and we are essentially a digital credit platform focused on consumers in India who are digitally native but not well served by the banking system. And we offer 3 products. We offer checkout financing at the point of sale for consumers to be able to make purchases more affordable and split them over multiple EMIs. In this, we work with several large players like Amazon, Razorpay, others. We also offer personal loans for customers for episodic needs, both self-employed as well as salaried. And finally, through our app, we also offer a suite of personal finance management features, such as expense tracking, savings, budgeting, bill reminders, etc. So our goal is to be a responsible financial services platform for the next 100 million customers in India who are starting to meaningfully manage their finances more proactively and living a largely digital life.
Got it. That's very interesting. So let's straight away dive into the agenda. So for every marketer, right, the first question is, whenever you're launching a new product or a new feature or even a new company, right, how do you go about acquiring your first few thousand customers, right? It's all, so would love to learn from you. What were some of the things that you did in figuring out the acquisition strategy that would work while you went about acquiring the first few thousand customers? And what were some of the learnings there that you baked into as you scaled from there?
I'll answer your question with where we are in present day and then try and, draw the journey to get there. Right?
Sure.
Today, on a monthly basis, we acquire about 3 lakh new customers a month. And our marketing and customer acquisition spend on this is essentially 0.
Wow.
Right? Now, I'd be lying if I said we got here on day one. Right? The first 1,000 customers came from looking at a variety of different channels. Right? We looked at paid acquisition. We looked at affiliate-based acquisition, which in lending is a big thing, where you work with kind of DSAs and people like that. And we looked at partnerships, right? And the fundamental challenge that we faced is when you're selling credit, you actually don't want any kind of customer. You want a specific type of customer. And it's a very complicated business because on the one hand, you're telling customers, hey, come to me. And on the other hand, there's a good chance you tell that customer, thanks for coming to me, but no thanks, I can't give you a loan. Right? I think no other business in tech has this dynamic where you actively say no to a bunch of customers who come to you, right? So we kind of, as we work through this dilemma, we were trying to think through how do you bias your acquisition funnel to give you not just any kind of 100 customers, but how do you get your acquisition funnel to give you the right 100 customers? Right. And what we realized at the end of the day is, in lending, you want the best customer is someone who isn't coming looking for a loan. It's someone for whom the loan is contextually relevant at that point in time. And so the way we went about re-engineering our customer acquisition journey after kind of the first few 100,000 experiments is saying, how do we actually embed our product where customers are coming anyway, right? And that's what today people are calling embedded finance, right? That's where we ended up from a business model perspective, right? And today you can essentially, as a customer, find us at different points in your existing journey, in e-commerce, in personal finance, anywhere else. Right. And I think that was a very powerful learning for us is, rather than trying to find customers and sell your product to them, offer your product contextually where customers are anyway coming. So you bias it to give you the customers you want.
Got it. That's very interesting. Now, I would say that works beautifully in a lending business, right? Where you can embed your product, where the customer needs it. But one question that every marketer has is, how do you balance between paid acquisition, which will give you rapid growth, but of course it comes at a cost, versus building sustainable, low-cost acquisition channels, whether it is organic, whether it is referral. So how do you balance between the two? And that too, when you're chasing growth, right? It's always easy to throw money and get customers. But the prudent thing to do would be build the organic muscle as well, right? So how do you balance the two?
It's a very good question. And I think, as you said, the holy grail is low-cost acquisition. But I think there's two muscles you need to build alongside that are very important, right? One is, as you said, paid acquisition. The only thing I would say there is it needs to be done in a very controlled environment, because otherwise it's the easy way out.
Right.
And what we found is every time we opened the floodgates on paid acquisition, the entire team's energies would inevitably go there, because inputs equal outputs very quickly.
Correct.
If you want to, in some ways, almost force yourself to build organic, low-cost acquisition, you have to ring-fence your paid acquisition efforts. Now, ring-fencing, it could mean putting a cap on budget. It could mean putting a cap on contributions and saying, look, not more than 30% of my customer acquisition any month should come from paid.
Mm-hmm.
It could also mean organizationally creating separate teams to do that.
Right.
But you're absolutely right, it is a muscle. The third muscle that I would say is very important is actually remarketing and re-engagement. And I think that's where I feel a lot of companies in India, ourselves included, kind of overlook in the early days, right? Because in India, like over a period of time, acquiring a large number of customers actually isn't that hard, given the kind of the dynamics in the market. It's getting those customers to actually make money for you, driving up those ARPUs over time, and actually being able to actually create those cohorts where you can say that, this customer cohort 1 year down is actually making 2x revenue and 3x contribution margin versus, let's say, an M0 cohort. Right. That is really the holy grail.
Right.
And so for us, it was about creating this kind of ring-fenced paid acquisition engine on the one hand, but also building really smart customer lifetime value muscles.
Right.
That could ensure that once a customer comes in the door, we're actually able to increase value, customer lifetime value over time.
God, that's very interesting. That also brings me to the point of retention, but I'll come to that in a bit. But before I get there, right, everybody has to do paid acquisition at some point in time, right? And more so in the early days. And while you're at it, at what point or how do you decide that it is the right time to push the pedal on paid acquisition, right? You would be doing a bunch of experiments through paid acquisition, but some things will work and you want to double down on that and make sure that you are driving the maximum ROI there. So in your point of view, or from your experience, when is the right time to push the pedal on paid acquisition?
It's a good question. So I'll give you the example of our app, right? Personal finance app, which was called Walnut earlier when it came through an acquisition. We defined two metrics, right? One was obviously cost per download, but the second was actually a metric that we called ARPU, but it wasn't a revenue metric. It was actually what was the richness of data on that individual customer when they would sign up for us. Because if a customer actually had rich data, we could do a lot more with that customer. And we basically set ourselves goals of saying, look, when cost per download gets to X and ARPU per customer gets to Y, we've reached a happy place and we're ready to push the gas on that, right? And so for us, for example, on this, it was getting to like a 25 rupee per download cost. On ARPU, it was getting to a point where there was a certain thickness of data. We created a data thickness metric. Once we balanced these two, we were ready to press on the gas and then we saw downloads grow. But I think the key in paid acquisition is you have to have both an efficiency metric, which is generally your CAC, but you have to have a quality metric to ensure that the customers you're getting are actually the right customers. And when that kind of Goldilocks moment gets hit, that's when at least we decide to press the accelerator.
Got it. That's very interesting. Going back to the question on increasing the ARPU or the LTV of the customer, in early days, it's very hard to predict how long the customer would stay for any product, right? And we do a lot of early stage investments. So, of course, we see a lot of Excel models where the LTV to CAC is like 10x in 1 year or 2 years, right? So, how do you go about understanding the LTV of the customer that you acquire early, right? That is one. And second, you need to retain those customers and monetize those customers regularly, right? So, what are some of the things that worked on the retention side for you? What are some of the playbooks that work for you there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? And I always feel LTV is one of these, mythical metrics that I've yet to see a LTV calculation that doesn't have some large leap of faith embedded somewhere in it, right? Whether it's the discount rate, the churn rate, whatever it is. So I think what we found is we needed a metric below LTV to really figure out kind of if the model was working, right? And for us, that was actually customer engagement,
right?
Which very simply for a lending business is repeat rates. Right? And the quality metric for that was loss rates. Because you can run a great lending business where you give 10 loans to a customer and they go bust. Or you can run a great lending business where in a given cohort, Your good customers take loans more frequently, and the NPAs of those loans actually are lower than a new customer.
Right.
That was the Goldilocks moment for us when we do cohort analysis, right? And so essentially, we actually started to actually map out these curves, right? And look at GMV retention, revenue retention, default rates, and then contribution margin.
Right.
And it's only after 3 years of watching these cohorts that I think we actually felt we had a handle to be able to say this is the likely LTV of a customer.
Right.
It's just about keeping your nose to the ground and tracking something that you can track on a weekly or monthly basis, which for us was repeat rates.
Right. Got it. And moving on the retention side, right? I mean, it's easier to monetize a retained customer than acquire and monetize a new customer. So, what are some of the things that you did for improved retention of your customers over time, right? And again, lending for some customers could be a high frequency use case or borrowing here, while for some others it could be a low frequency use case, right? So how do you figure out who to retain and how to monetize the retained customer?
No, it's a great question, right? So I think we think about this on two levels, right? So at the base level, your product needs to be easy to use. Now it sounds like a very obvious thing, but I think what we've seen consistently in India is when you actually eliminate friction from CX, that itself drives retention and repeat rates. Right? We've seen it in UPI, we've seen it in a whole bunch of other products. And so the product has to be consistently easy to use for a customer. But I would say that's table stakes today.
Mm-hmm.
What you really have to do to drive alpha and retention is be able to actually demonstrate increasing value to the repeat customer. And what that means is the second, third, and fourth time a customer comes to you, the value of your offering has to proportionately increase,
right?
Or in some cases, disproportionately increase as well, right? Because you're constantly raising expectations of that customer, and so the baseline also keeps going up, right? And so for us, it was this idea of low and grow, right? Which is a very powerful idea in credit because you can start a whole bunch of people small if you don't understand their risk. But as you see performance data from them and you see utilization patterns, that data ends up being the most predictive in their future risk of default. And so, this is what, not to get too technical, but we call line management in the consumer finance world. How do you ensure that over a period of time you're able to consistently reward and incentivize good behavior by evolving the product to become more and more useful to that customer? Now, use could be in terms of size. Sometimes the best experience is just a bigger loan or a bigger credit line. Use could be in terms of actual use cases. So in the case of checkout finance, a customer being able to use this across multiple places. Use could also be that good behavior unlocks more products, right? Which in our case, for example, could be a larger personal loan or something else over time.
Got it.
And I think creating this kind of upgrade, low and grow pathway for customers became almost, I would say, like a secret weapon for us that started to play out over time, to the point where today it's actually a core part of our brand identity, right? One of the things we message in our branding when we meet a customer is, we grow with you.
Right.
And I think that has been probably the single biggest factor in driving retention.
Got it. The other thing, does channel come into play, the acquisition channel come into play when you think of customer retention, right? And again, where I'm coming from is, you've seen in startups, there's few channels where you're able to acquire customers at say 1/3, 1/4 of the regular CAC. But 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the line, you realize that this customer doesn't retain well or the LTV is low, right? So how do you kind of balance that, where you also need new customers coming in and you're getting them at low cost from some channels, but the retention is low and hence it may be a leaky bucket?
No, I think it all comes down to the context of that channel, right? Because at least what we've seen is ultimately retention is driven by customer intimacy. There are certain channels where customers are shopping, they're casually looking around, right? And they look at those channels as very utilitarian, right? I get it, I get my loan, I'm done.
Yep.
And there are certain channels which are higher context, and therefore when the customers who enter through those channels tend to actually be more invested in the decision.
Right.
It's actually fascinating, right? The same customer who comes through, let's say, an online loan broker will retain very differently than a customer who you actually acquire through your own app with a product hook. And so you can't You can't rely only on one channel.
Yep.
But then the question for us becomes, even when people come in through these so-called commodity channels, how do you create product hooks early in that journey so you can win over that customer?
Right.
And they don't see you as someone who basically was a service provider on a commodified marketplace.
Got it. The other thing, I mean, in your case, you have 3 different products, right? And from what I understood, Personal Finance Manager acts more like an acquisition product. And then over time, you can monetize those users through checkout financing and eventually personal loans. So was this something that you had in mind from day zero itself, that you need to have an acquisition product, an engagement product, and monetization product? Or did that happen over time? And should people think of building products that way, that you need to have an acquisition product, an engagement product, and then finally a monetization product?
I'll be honest, I think this is a process of discovery, right? I think the reality is you have to experiment, right?
Right.
And what we've seen over time is each product maybe has a core value proposition, but it also plays other roles. Right? Personal Finance Manager, great acquisition product, great retention product, because the best borrowers are those who actually want to be on top of their finances, right? And see value in a Personal Finance Manager in addition to taking a loan. Right? Sometimes offering that one-off personal loan when someone had a need creates so much loyalty because you were there for them when they needed something. You weren't just a fair weather friend. Right? So I would almost think of it as a matrix, right? Certain products will be like heroes on acquisition, but great, number 2 batsman or number 3 batsman on retention.
Yep.
And it just comes down to a process of discovery. But I would say that it's very helpful. While you don't have too many products, but it's helpful to have a few different products so you can play around with acquisition and retention hooks and see what works.
Got it. Moving on a little bit on the numbers and metrics side, right? So you can only improve what you measure. So in your case, if you share some learnings on what are some of the metrics that mattered the most, whether it was on the acquisition side or on the retention side, and how did you go about defining those metrics on the acquisition or the retention side? What makes sense and how do you measure them?
Yeah, so most lending businesses historically have oriented on loan disbursals.
Yeah.
Right? If you go to a bank or a large NBFC, they'll say, I gave out 100 crores. We started out that way, and somewhere in the middle of the journey decided to actually reorient ourselves to make the customer the building block of the business. That had a very fundamental change in the mindset of the organization, because suddenly people were thinking customer first, product per customer, LTV. Right? Within customers, there was a huge debate as to what you want to focus on. And so for us, at the end of the day, the metric that we really care about is monthly transacting customers. Everything else is vanity. Right? After putting the customer at the center of the equation, the next question became utilization, right? Whether you want to call it GMV, loan, disbursal, whatever. That's a pretty simple metric for any business, right? What is the value of the SKU you're selling? In our case, the SKU is credit. Right? This is the easy part. Then it gets hard, right? Because again, fundamentally in our business, banking, as someone once said to me, is a commodity business, right? The only way you win is you either keep your cost of capital really low, we were discussing this, you keep your distribution cost low, and you keep your risk low. Cost of capital for a fintech is a hard thing to control in the early days. You have to win on distribution and OPEX, and you have to win on NPA. And for us, these two became the North Star quality metrics that we focus on. Right? And so we built the organization over time to always have this idea of there's a growth metric and there's a quality metric. And you always have to look at them in tandem. And sometimes, for example, you can combine this, right? In lending, there's a nice metric called risk-adjusted return, which is basically the yield you earn and learn minus the loss rate. If you can, it's a very hard metric to embed into the DNA of an organization because people think growth and risk and they love fighting with each other about this. But if you can get, like, for example, the product manager on a product to think in terms of risk-adjusted return, we found like half the battle is done.
Right.
Because that same person, the moment they see delinquencies go up, will pull back on growth. And if they see that the loss rates are holding really well, they'll push the accelerator. Right. So I think creating these kind of unique metrics that work for you, that balance the tensions that you need to balance in your organization, and then creating a culture where these metrics get prioritized above vanity metrics.
Right.
That is what has worked for us. And I'll be honest, it's a work in progress.
Right. Yeah, a related point would be, it's hard to come to these metrics in the first go itself, right? So you iterate over time and then figure out what works for you. The second part is, in the journey of building a company, right? Metrics that would have mattered early in the journey would be very different from what matters now, right? So how does one go about identifying and prioritizing and then internalizing those metrics, more importantly, right, in the journey of a startup from an early stage to a growth stage? What are some of your learnings? How did you go about doing it?
It's a really hard problem. And as you said, right, you get what you measure, but what I never realized is once you figure out what you're measuring, your organization runs entirely on that.
To optimize that metric.
Yes. And then to change that is massive, even in a 100, 200, 300, in our case, 600-person organization, right? I think what we found helpful is on a regular cadence, challenge the metric itself, right? Because otherwise you get into this very nice, I wouldn't call it inertia, but you get into this nice rhythm of you have your weekly trackers, your monthly trackers, your dashboard. We're all really good at building those.
Yep.
You keep looking at the same metric day in and day out. All you care about is the value of that metric. I found that a metrics challenging session of saying, look, is this the right thing we're looking at? Really matters, right? And that's, for example, where our idea of monthly transacting users came out. For the longest time, we looked at customers, active customers, right?
Right.
And people who we've added, who've taken a loan in the last 12 months. And we all chased this. And finally, we're like, guys, who are we fooling here, right? Is this really what we want to drive? Right? And we're not getting the results here. So then we said, look, should we look at disbursals? And we're like, we could, but I can get, I can get a 1 crore disbursal from one person or a 1 crore disbursal from 1,000 people. I'm trying to get it from 1,000 people. So it's not disbursals. And that's how we eventually came on to the idea of MTUs, which is not a very lending metric. It's very much a SaaS or a consumer metric, but it worked for us, right? Similar thing with risk-adjusted return or risk-adjusted margin. So I found that from time to time on a regular cadence, just challenging the metric itself has been helpful.
I have one final question, Shashank, for you, which is, now that you have spent about 8 years building this business, you know a lot of things now. What is one thing that you know now that you wish you knew when you started up?
I would say the benefits of focus. I think we were driven by a lot of fear of missing out in the early days. And I think that's natural in India. There's so many things to do and there's so many opportunities you can go after and so many channels you can try. But ultimately, as we were discussing, I think compounding is the most powerful force in a startup. You want to pick a couple of things you want to really focus on, have conviction in, and then just compound the learnings over a long enough period of time. The most damaging thing that I have found internally is when you do stop starts, because then you cut the compounding journey. And I would say that exists in product, it exists in risk, but it exists the most in marketing, because marketing is that one field where you can try a whole bunch of different things, but there's a lot of value to picking 2 channels, right, and making up a number, but just pick a few channels and just stick with them. And over a period of time, that becomes a moat in itself.
Right. On that note, we'll end this discussion. Thanks a lot, Shashank.
Thank you.